My name is Chloe, and I'm 32 years old. For most of my life, I existed as a footnote in my own family's grand, glossy story. I was the sensible one, the quiet daughter who worked a stable but unremarkable job as a historical archivist, while my parents and my older brother lived loud, glittering lives in their sprawling lakeside mansion. My only real inheritance, the only place I ever felt truly seen, was a small, rustic lake house my grandmother had left solely to me. It was my sanctuary, the keeper of my soul. But last month, while I was 3,000 miles away on a research trip, my parents sold it. They forged my name, cashed the check, and funneled the money to my brother to save his latest disastrous business venture, all without a single word to me. What they didn't know, as they toasted to their own cunning, was that their magnificent mansion, the very stage for their perfect lives, was a house of cards built on a mountain of secret debt, and that for the past 6 months, their sensible, invisible daughter had been the anonymous benefactor secretly paying their mortgage. They had just sold the one thing I loved to save the son they prized. They never, ever expected that in doing so, they had just handed the keys to their entire kingdom to the daughter they had always forgotten. If you have ever been the responsible one, the one who is expected to be strong while everyone else is allowed to be fragile, I want you to feel seen right now. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, because this story is for you. And before I tell you how a forged signature led to the most audacious power play of my life, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You are not going to want to miss how this ends. In the carefully curated museum that was the Prescott family, my older brother, Liam, was the main exhibit, constantly under a shining spotlight. I was the invisible foundation holding the whole building up. Liam was a force of nature, a whirlwind of charisma and reckless optimism. He was a serial entrepreneur, a title my parents uttered with a reverence usually reserved for Nobel laureates. In reality, it meant he had a preternatural gift for creating spectacular, expensive failures. I, on the other hand, was an archivist. My world was one of quiet, climate-controlled rooms, of acid-free paper and the patient, meticulous work of preserving the past. I spent my days piecing together the stories of other people's lives because the story of my own life, within my own family, seemed to be of no interest to anyone. My parents, Richard and Catherine Prescott, were the chief curators of the family image. Their sprawling mansion in the exclusive enclave of Hawthorne Estates was less a home and more a stage set. Every piece of furniture, every polished silver frame, a prop in their lifelong performance of effortless wealth and social standing. My father, a retired thoracic surgeon, carried himself with the gravitas of a man whose family had come over on the Mayflower, despite the fact his fortune was barely a generation old and, as I would discover, mostly an illusion. My mother was his loyal co-producer, a woman who could discern a person's social value from the make of their handbag at 50 paces. In this grand theater, Liam was the leading man. His every move was celebrated, his every mistake cushioned and excused. I was the stagehand, working in the shadows, ensuring the lights stayed on and the sets didn't collapse. This wasn't a new development. It was the bedrock of our existence. I remember my high school graduation with a painful clarity. I was the valedictorian. I had spent weeks crafting a speech about the future, about the quiet power of building a life brick by brick. As I stood at the podium, my heart pounding, I looked out at the sea of faces and found the 2 empty seats where my parents were supposed to be. I later found them in the lobby, my father deep in a loud, important-sounding phone call, closing a deal to get Liam a summer internship that was essentially a paid 3-month vacation in Europe. My mother was beside him, nodding along, her face a mask of wifely devotion. They had missed my entire speech. "Oh, honey, we are so sorry," she'd said later, squeezing my arm. Richard's call was just so crucial for Liam's future. You understand. I did understand. I understood that my actual, tangible achievement was less important than the potential for one of Liam's. When I was 17, After 3 years of working weekends at a local diner, I bought my first car, a 10-year-old Toyota Camry with 80,000 miles on it. I paid for it with my own money. My father's reaction was to sit me down and give me a stern lecture on the high cost of insurance and maintenance, warning me not to be car poor. 6 months later, for his own 17th birthday, Liam received a brand new Jeep Wrangler. He crashed it within 3 months, and they bought him another one to teach him about second chances. My only true refuge from this dynamic was the lake house. It had belonged to my grandmother, Margaret Hale, my mother's mother. She was a woman who smelled of cinnamon and old books, and whose love was a quiet, steady warmth, not a dazzling, conditional spotlight. The mansion was a place of polished surfaces and unspoken rules. The lake house was a place of worn wooden floors, mismatched coffee mugs, and the freedom to just be. She and I had spent our summers there, reading on the porch swing, identifying birds, and talking for hours about everything and nothing. She was the only person who ever asked me about my work with a genuine curiosity, who saw my quiet nature not as a lack of passion, but as a sign of its depth. When she passed away 5 years ago, her will was a quiet earthquake that sent shockwaves through the family. She left my parents a respectable sum of money and some jewelry, but the lake house, the crown jewel of her small estate, she left to me, and me alone. The language in the will was precise, and, I now realize, prophetic. To my granddaughter Chloe, who I trust to be the custodian of our family's true history, not its fleeting ambitions. May this house always be your anchor in any storm. My parents' reaction was a study in controlled fury. They couldn't overtly object, but their disapproval was a cold front that settled over the family for months. "It's a lovely gesture, of course," my mother had said, her lips a thin, tight line. "But it's such a burden for a young woman. The taxes, the upkeep. Really, it would have been more practical to sell it and add it to the family trust." What she meant was, it would have been more practical to add it to the family's slush fund for Liam. But I held firm. The house was more than property. It was my heart's home. It was the only part of my inheritance that felt real. The one thing I believed could never be touched by the transactional nature of my family's love. I was wrong. The storm my grandmother had predicted was coming, and I was about to find out just how desperately they needed my anchor to save their own sinking ship. The storm that would eventually capsize my family's carefully constructed world began, as all their storms did, with my brother. Liam's latest and greatest entrepreneurial masterpiece was a disruptive green tech startup he had christened Viridian Dynamics. The name was meaningless, but it sounded impressive, which was the entire point. He had a stunningly designed pitch deck, which I, of course, had created for him during a frantic, coffee-fueled weekend, a leased office in a trendy downtown high-rise that was mostly empty, and a talent for using words like synergy, scalability, and blockchain in a single sentence. He was, in essence, a professional mirage. He had charmed an initial round of seed funding out of my father's network of wealthy, golf-playing friends, but the mirage was beginning to shimmer and fade. The product was non-existent. The developers he'd hired were in a constant state of confusion, and he was burning through cash at a terrifying rate. He was on the hunt for a major Series A investment, the kind of multi-million-dollar infusion that would not only keep the company afloat, but would finally cement his status as a legitimate tech mogul in my parents' adoring eyes. They spoke of this funding round with a hushed, reverent awe, as if it were a foregone conclusion. "Once Liam closes this round," my father would say at dinner, "everything changes. He'll be set for life. We'll all be set for life." While they were obsessing over Liam's illusory future, my own life had been quietly and profoundly transformed by the past. My work at the university archives had led me to the personal collection of Silas Croft, a reclusive and eccentric tech pioneer who had passed away the year before. Croft was a legend, a man who had made billions in the early days of personal computing, but he was also a notorious recluse who had hoarded every scrap of paper he had ever touched. My job was a historical treasure hunt, a deep dive into the mind of a genius. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, while sifting through a box of his old uncatalogued financial journals from the late 2000s, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a single, cryptic entry, almost a doodle, on a page dated November 2008. It was a string of characters and a note, 10,000 units of the future. A foolish little bet. It was attached to a small, sealed envelope containing a USB drive. I knew enough about Croft's history to know that he was fascinated by the nascent world of cryptography. My hands trembling, I took the journal and the drive to the university's head of digital forensics. What we discovered was beyond comprehension. The foolish little bet was an early, massive purchase of Bitcoin, made when it was worth pennies. The USB drive was the key to a digital wallet that had sat untouched for over a decade. Its value had since skyrocketed into the stratosphere. It was worth nearly $5 million. The legal process that followed was complex and confidential. As the archivist who made the discovery, and as per the explicit terms of Silas Croft's donation agreement with the university, I was entitled to a finder's fee. It was a standard clause designed to incentivize thorough research. I never expected it to be activated on this scale. After months of quiet legal wrangling, a wire transfer for $500,000, my 10% fee, was deposited into a new private bank account I had opened. It was a staggering, life-altering amount of money that I told no one about. It felt like a secret, sacred trust from a man I had only known through his papers. It was security. It was independence. It was a silent, powerful truth that I held close to my chest. Then, about 6 months before the sale of my lake house, my secret truth collided with my family's secret lie. A thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was addressed to my parents at their Hawthorne Estates address, but had a bright yellow forwarding sticker with my own address on it. I had lived with my parents for a few months after graduate school and had forgotten to cancel the old mail forwarding order. My first thought was that it was a wedding invitation. I opened it without thinking. It was not an invitation. It was a formal, final notice of delinquency from a private wealth management bank I had never heard of. It stated that the mortgage on my parents' mansion was 120 days past due, and that foreclosure proceedings were set to begin in 30 days. I sank down onto my sofa, the letter shaking in my hand. The mansion, the parties, the trips, the endless funding of Liam's failures. It was all a sham, a performance financed by crippling debt. They weren't wealthy. They were drowning, and the water was rising fast. My first reaction was a cold, hard fury. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They had spent my entire life looking down on my sensible choices, while their own lives were a monument to reckless irresponsibility. But as the anger subsided, it was replaced by a deep, weary sadness. The thought of them losing everything, of their carefully constructed world collapsing into a pile of public humiliation, was a tragedy I couldn't bear to watch. They were foolish and blind, but they were still my parents. So, I made a choice. Using my secret inheritance, the money that had come to me from a ghost of the past, I decided to become a ghost myself. I contacted a high-profile financial attorney and, through him, set up a blind trust. From that anonymous entity, I paid off the entire arrears on their mortgage and arranged to have the substantial monthly payments made automatically going forward. The bank simply informed my parents that an anonymous third-party benefactor had intervened to resolve their account. I can only imagine their reaction. I'm sure they never once suspected me. They probably assumed it was a wealthy friend of my father's, a quiet favor between men of a certain stature. They would have accepted it as their due, another piece of evidence that the world was designed to work in their favor. They went on with their lives, completely unaware that their saviors, the silent benefactor propping up their entire fragile existence, was the unambitious daughter they had never learned to see. I had become the secret, silent owner of their gilded cage, and my rent was their continued blissful ignorance. Living with the secret knowledge of my family's precarious finances and my own hidden power was like wearing a pair of glasses that brought their behavior into sharp, painful focus. Every casual slight, every dismissive comment, every act of blatant favoritism was no longer just a personal hurt. It was a profound insult, magnified by the secret reality of my role as their anonymous savior. The final 6 months before they sold my lake house were a slow burn, a relentless accumulation of small betrayals that, in retrospect, were all leading to the same inevitable catastrophic fire. It started with my career. The university offered me a promotion, a prestigious position as the head of special collections. It was a huge step, a recognition of years of dedicated work. It came with a significant raise and the responsibility of managing my own department. I was ecstatic. I called my mother, my voice filled with a genuine, unburdened joy I hadn't felt in years. I told her the news, expecting, for once, a flicker of real pride. "Oh, that's nice, Chloe," she said, and I could hear the clinking of ice in a glass in the background. "Head of Special Collections, it sounds very important. Listen, can I call you back? Liam is about to have a conference call with some potential investors in Singapore, and your father and I are helping him run through the time zone calculations. It's dreadfully confusing, but this could be a game changer for Viridian Dynamics." And that was it. My career milestone, the biggest of my life, was reduced to a brief, inconvenient interruption in the all-important, all-consuming drama of Liam's imaginary success. The call never came back. A few weeks later, I decided to do something for myself. The quiet security of my finances had given me a newfound confidence. I had always loved to travel, but had never had the means. I booked a 2-week trip to Italy, a solo journey to immerse myself in the archives of Florence and the art of Rome. When I told my parents my plans, they were aghast. "Italy? Alone?" my mother had gasped, as if I had announced I was joining the circus. "Chloe, is that really sensible? It's so extravagant. You should be saving your money, not squandering it on vacations." My father was even more blunt. "I don't understand this," he said, shaking his head with a look of genuine disappointment. "Your brother is working 24/7 to build an empire, and you're taking a holiday. You need to be more focused on your future, on building real assets." The lecture on financial prudence, coming from a man whose house I secretly owned, was so galling I could barely respond. "My future is my own business, Dad," I'd said, my voice colder than I intended. The trip was incredible. It was a taste of the freedom I had secretly purchased. But their reaction cast a long shadow, a reminder that, in their eyes, my life was only acceptable if it remained small, sensible, and secondary to my brother's grand, reckless ambitions. The most telling incidents, however, all revolved around the lake house. It had become my weekend project, my tangible joy. I poured my time, my energy, and a not insignificant amount of my money into it. I had the old wiring and plumbing completely redone. I found a local artisan to restore the original stone fireplace. I spent hours on my hands and knees, sanding and staining the wide plank pine floors until they glowed with a warm, honeyed light. The house was no longer just rustic. It was becoming a work of art, a perfect blend of history and comfort. I invited my parents over one beautiful Sunday in September, hoping that seeing the physical transformation, the love and care I had poured into it, would finally make them understand its value to me. Their reaction was a masterclass in passive-aggressive dismissal. They walked through the rooms, their faces carefully neutral. "Well, you've certainly been busy," my mother commented, tracing a finger through the air as if searching for dust that wasn't there. "It's very clean." My father, ever the pragmatist, just shook his head. "I hope you got a good deal on that contractor, Chloe," he said. "This is a terrible return on investment. The value of this property is in the land, not this old cottage. You're throwing good money after bad." Then Liam arrived, late and unannounced as always. bringing with him two friends I had never met. He strode through the house like he was the lord of the manor, not even acknowledging the work I had done. He led his friends out onto the new deck I had just finished building. "See?" he said, his voice loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. "This is what I'm talking about, a teardown, obviously. But you could build a monster 4-bedroom contemporary right here. Infinity pool over there. Imagine the parties we could throw." My blood ran cold. He was standing on my deck, in my sanctuary, and casually planning its demolition. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of orange and pink, I watched my father put a comforting arm around Liam's shoulder as they stood on the dock. I couldn't hear their words, but I could see the familiar dynamic. My father, his face a mask of paternal concern and pride. My brother, his expression a mixture of anxiety and entitlement. They were standing on my property, a property I was lovingly restoring, and they were talking about his needs, his company, his future. I was merely the custodian of a piece of land that they were already, in their minds, mentally repurposing for his benefit. They weren't just taking me for granted. They were slowly, deliberately, erasing me from my own story, and I was letting them do it. The fire was coming, and I was standing in a house made of wood, foolishly believing that love would be enough to protect it. The act itself was a masterpiece of cowardly betrayal, executed with the silent, efficient precision of an assassination. It happened while I was in Los Angeles, immersed in the rarefied, sun-drenched world of the Getty Research Institute. I had been awarded a highly competitive 2-week fellowship to study a collection of rare, illuminated manuscripts. It was a dream come true, a validation of my entire career. I was working in a quiet, beautiful library, surrounded by priceless history, feeling for the first time like I was in a place where I truly belonged. I was so absorbed in my work, so disconnected from the petty dramas of my family life, that I missed the warning signs. I ignored the unusual silence from my parents, the uncharacteristically brief and vague texts. I mistook their lack of contact for a rare and welcome respect for my professional life. In reality, it was the quiet before the kill. The news arrived not with a tearful confession or a dramatic confrontation, but with the cold, impersonal chime of a real estate app notification. It was my last night in LA. I was sitting in my hotel room, packing my bags for the flight home the next morning, feeling a sense of deep accomplishment and a quiet melancholy that my trip was over. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. I glanced at it, expecting a message from a colleague. The notification was from Zillow. The subject line read, "Update on your saved property, 112 Willow Lane, Northwood." My heart gave a painful lurch. 112 Willow Lane, my lake house. I had saved it in the app years ago, a sentimental habit to watch its value fluctuate. I tapped on the notification, a cold, sick feeling spreading through my chest. The screen refreshed, and there it was, in bold, stark, unforgiving letters. Sold, $450,000. Sale date, the 2nd of November. Today's date. Sold. For a long moment, I couldn't process it. My mind refused to accept the information. It had to be a mistake, a database error, a cruel, inexplicable glitch. My fingers, trembling and clumsy, fumbled to dial my mother's number. Straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Catherine. Please leave a message." Her cheerful, recorded voice was a grotesque mockery. I called my father. "Straight to voicemail. This is Richard Prescott. I'll get back to you at my earliest convenience." I called Liam. The phone rang once, then clicked. The call declined. He had actively rejected my call. The dread that had been a slow, creeping vine now wrapped around my throat, squeezing the air from my lungs. This wasn't a glitch. This was a conspiracy. My training as an archivist, the instinct to find the primary source, took over. My hands shaking so badly I could barely type, I logged into the county's official public records portal. I navigated to the property deeds database and searched for the address. And there it was. A deed of sale, filed and executed that very afternoon. A cash buyer. And at the bottom of the document, in the space for the seller's signature, was my name, Chloe Prescott. Except it wasn't my name. It was a crude, almost insulting forgery. The elegant, looping C I had practiced for years was a clumsy, childish circle. The confident stroke of the P was hesitant and broken. It was a ghost's signature, a hollow imitation of my identity, and it had been used to sign away the one piece of the world that was truly mine. I stumbled away from my laptop and sank onto the floor of the hotel room, a strangled, guttural sob escaping my lips. The violation was so profound, so absolute, it felt physical. They hadn't just sold a house. They had taken my grandmother's legacy, the sacred ground of my happiest memories, and sold it for parts. They had taken my name, my legal identity, and used it to commit a crime against me. And I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and clear as the ice water now flooding my veins, exactly where the $450,000 was going. It was for Viridian Dynamics. It was for Liam. They had bulldozed my past to build a flimsy, temporary bridge for his failing future. The flight home the next day was a fugue state. I sat staring out the window at the clouds, my mind a churning vortex of rage and grief. The casual cruelties of the past few months now looked like what they were, a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. My father's lecture about the house being a money pit, my mother's dismissive comments, Liam's talk of a teardown, they weren't just opinions, they were justifications. They were building their case in their own minds, convincing themselves that what they were planning was not a theft, but a sensible financial decision made on behalf of their flighty, impractical daughter. When I landed, I didn't go home. I drove my rental car straight to the lake. It was a cold, gray November day, the trees bare, the water the color of slate. I parked at the end of the driveway and looked. The red sold sign was a wound on the front lawn. The lights were on inside the house. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the porch steps. A new family was already living inside my memories. They were living in my grandmother's house, a house bought with stolen money, under the authority of a ghost's signature. That was the moment the grief finally broke through the rage. It was a raw, animalistic howl of a feeling, a pain so deep I thought it might split me in two. They had taken my sanctuary. They had taken my name. They had taken everything. As I sat there in the encroaching twilight, the cold seeping into my bones, a new feeling began to emerge, crystallizing out of the pain. It was a cold, hard, and beautifully simple resolve. They had treated me like a ghost for my entire life. They had no idea I was about to learn how to haunt. The rage and grief of that first night were a crucible. They burned away the last vestiges of the compliant, quiet daughter I used to be. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist. My family had played a game of chess with my life, and they thought they had achieved checkmate. They had no idea I was about to flip the board over and reveal that I had been playing a completely different game all along, and that I already owned all the pieces. My first move was not to call them and scream, which is what they would have expected. My first move was to call Evelyn Reed. I sat in her sunlit, minimalist office, a stark contrast to the turbulent chaos in my soul, and I laid out the new, damning evidence. I presented the forged deed, the record of the sale, and the declined calls. My voice was steady, my hands were still. I was an archivist presenting her findings. Evelyn's reaction was not one of sympathy, but of a cold, controlled fury that mirrored my own. "Chloe," she said, her voice sharp and clear as glass. "This elevates things significantly. This is no longer a matter of family drama. This is a federal crime. Forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud. Your parents and your brother are facing a legal firestorm that could land them in prison." The word prison hung in the air, a stark and terrifying possibility. "But," she continued, a predatory glint in her eye, "a public prosecution is a blunt instrument. I believe a more surgical approach is in order. We need to consolidate your power before we make a single move. My secret weapon, the foundation of my entire strategy, was not just the money I had inherited, it was my mind. I was a researcher, a digger, a patient, relentless seeker of truth. While Evelyn's team began drafting the legal paperwork to challenge the sale and place a freeze on the stolen funds, I launched my own covert operation. I started by using my secret ownership of their mansion's mortgage to my advantage. Through Evelyn, I was able to legally access a detailed financial statement on the property. The picture it painted was one of spectacular, almost artistic financial mismanagement. They had multiple lines of credit tapped out against the house's value, a series of high-interest personal loans, and a history of late payments on nearly every utility. They weren't just living paycheck to paycheck. They were living on a prayer, juggling debts and robbing Peter to pay a very angry Paul. Their entire identity was a lie, a performance they could no longer afford. Next, I focused my research skills on Liam and Viridian dynamics. I spent 3 days in the university's business library, using their powerful databases to create a complete corporate and personal profile. What I unearthed was a pattern of deceit and failure that was almost impressive in its consistency. He had left a trail of burned investors and failed LLCs across 3 states. Viridian Dynamics was nothing more than a shell company, a vehicle to collect funds that were being systematically siphoned into a personal, offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't just planning to save his company with my money, he was planning to flee the country with it. He wasn't just a bad entrepreneur, he was a common thief, just like our parents. The final, crucial piece of my gambit came from a place of deep, personal knowledge. While I was organizing the Silas Croft archives, I had become intimately familiar with his network of associates. I knew who he trusted, who he respected, and who he owed favors to. One name stood out: Marcus Thorne, the legendary and fearsome CEO of Thorne Capital, a private equity firm known for its aggressive but brilliant acquisitions. Croft's journals were filled with stories of their early collaborations, but I also found something else: a collection of personal letters detailing Thorne's secret passion. He was an avid collector of pre-war architecture, specifically the style of my parents' mansion. He saw these homes not just as assets, but as pieces of American history to be preserved. A wild, audacious, and terrifying plan began to form in my mind. It was a high-stakes poker game, and I was about to go all in. I had Evelyn draft a detailed business proposal. It wasn't a plea for help. It was an investment opportunity. I used my connection to the Croft archives to get a meeting with Marcus Thorne himself. I flew to New York, walked into his cavernous, intimidating office high above the city, and I made my pitch. I presented my parents' mansion not as a family home, but as a distressed, high-value asset with significant historical value. I detailed their financial insolvency, the imminent threat of foreclosure, which I now had the power to initiate, and the opportunity to acquire it for a fraction of its market value. My vision was not to flip it for a quick profit. It was to partner with him. I would put up my entire inheritance as capital. Thorne Capital would acquire the debt and the deed. We would then transform the mansion into the headquarters for the Margaret Hale Trust, my grandmother's legacy, a foundation dedicated to historical preservation, with the house itself as its crown jewel. I was asking him to help me buy my own family's home out from under them. Marcus Thorne, a man who had built an empire on calculated risks and identifying hidden value, listened to my entire pitch without saying a word. He looked at the financials, at the historical survey of the house I had prepared, at me. A long, agonizing silence filled the room. Then he leaned forward, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face. "Miss Prescott," he said, his voice a low, appreciative rumble, "you have the heart of an archivist and the guts of a killer. I'm in." I walked out of that building not just with a billionaire backer. I walked out with an army. The ghost they had tried to erase was now in command of a force they couldn't even imagine. And my family, blissfully ignorant, was about to find out that the house they lived in was no longer their castle. It was my opening move in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. The first shot in my silent war was not a cannon blast, but the quiet, decisive arrival of a legal courier. 1 week after my meeting with Marcus Thorne, 2 identical heavyweight cream envelopes were delivered, one to the gleaming, empty offices of Viridian Dynamics, and one to the front door of the Hawthorne Estates mansion. Inside was not a personal letter, but a cold, formal notice from the law firm of Reed and Associates. The language was brutal and precise. It informed them that the recent sale of 112 Willow Lane was under investigation for deed forgery and wire fraud. It stated that a forensic handwriting expert had already confirmed the signature was not mine. And it announced that all proceeds from the sale, the $450,000 that was supposed to be Liam's salvation, had been legally frozen by a court order, pending the outcome of the criminal and civil investigation. The final paragraph was the kill shot. It named Robert Prescott, Catherine Prescott, and Liam Prescott as the sole subjects of this investigation. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. My phone began to vibrate with a frantic, desperate energy, a symphony of their panic. My mother's texts were a waterfall of emotional blackmail and grammatical errors. "Chloe, how could you do this to us? After everything we have done for you? You are tearing this family apart." My father's were clipped, arrogant, and laced with threats. "You are playing with fire, young lady. Call me now. This is a profound misunderstanding that you will regret creating." Liam, true to form, was both venomous and pathetic. "Congrats, you finally got what you always wanted. To ruin my life. Hope you're happy." I didn't respond. I watched the messages pile up, each one a testament to their complete lack of remorse, their inability to see themselves as anything other than the victims. I let them spin in their tornado of fear for a full 72 hours. Then, Evelyn scheduled the meeting. It was held in the largest, most intimidating conference room at her firm. The room was all glass and chrome, with a massive mahogany table that felt like a slab in a morgue. I was there first, sitting at the head of the table, calm and composed in a simple dark gray suit. Evelyn sat to my right, a neat stack of files in front of her. They arrived together, a united front of crumbling delusion. They looked terrible. My father's face was ashen, his usual confident posture slumped. My mother's eyes were red and puffy, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the sleepless nights. Liam looked like a cornered animal, his usual charisma replaced by a sullen, resentful glare. My father, clinging to the last vestiges of his patriarchal authority, tried to take charge. "All right, Chloe, this has gone far enough," he began, his voice attempting a stern tone that just came out as shaky. "We were managing your asset. The market was hot. It was a smart financial move, and we were going to give you the profits, of course, after taking a small management fee." Evelyn let him finish, her expression unchanging. Then she leaned forward, her voice soft but carrying the deadly precision of a scalpel. "Robert," she said, "the time for fabricating self-serving narratives is over. Let me be clear about the reality of your situation." She then proceeded to systematically, and without emotion, dismantle their entire world. She laid out the evidence piece by piece on the gleaming mahogany table. The forensic report on the forged signature. The bank statements showing the immediate wire transfer of the full amount to Viridian Dynamics. The subsequent transfers from Viridian to Liam's personal offshore account in the Cayman Islands. "This isn't asset management, Robert," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "This is a textbook case of felony fraud, and a rather clumsy one at that. The district attorney's office is already very interested in this file." She let that sink in. I watched as the last bit of color drained from my father's face. My mother let out a small, choked sob. "But we are in a difficult position right now," Evelyn continued smoothly. My client, however, is a reasonable woman. She has no desire to see her own parents and brother face federal prosecution. A flicker of hope appeared in my mother's eyes. So, she is prepared to offer you a one-time, non-negotiable settlement. This was my moment. I spoke for the first time, my voice echoing slightly in the vast, silent room. I will instruct my attorney to drop all charges, both criminal and civil, I said, my gaze sweeping over their three shattered faces. On one condition. Evelyn slid a thick document across the table. You will, today, right now, sign over the deed and all ownership rights to the property at 45 Hawthorne Lane, your home, to a private trust that my client controls. My father's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a final desperate spark of defiance. You can't be serious. This is blackmail. You would take our home? You took mine, I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the glass walls around us. You took my past. I'm simply acquiring your present. It seems like a fair trade. My mother began to weep openly now. Chloe, please, she wailed. That house is our life. It's everything we've worked for. No, Mother, I said, the final, devastating truth falling from my lips. It's not. It's a lie. A lie you couldn't afford. The truth is, that house was about to go into foreclosure 6 months ago. The only reason you are still living in it is because I have been secretly paying your mortgage. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of three people's realities being simultaneously and violently annihilated. The benefactor. The anonymous savior they had taken for granted. It was me. It had been me all along. They stared at me. Their expressions a grotesque mixture of horror, shame, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of just how completely they had misjudged the game and the player they had tried to cheat. There was no more fight left in them. They were broken. My father, his hands trembling, picked up the pen. With the scratchy, final sound of his signature, he signed away his kingdom. My mother and Liam followed suit, their movements robotic, their eyes vacant. They had walked into that room as the proud Prescott family. They walked out as tenants, as ghosts in a house that now belonged to the daughter they had never seen. As I watched them go, I didn't feel the thrill of victory I had expected. I felt the quiet, somber satisfaction of a long overdue debt being paid in full. The archivist had just closed the book on a very painful chapter of her family's history. My ownership of the Hawthorne Estates mansion was not a conquest. It was a quiet, creeping occupation. I had no intention of evicting them. That would have been a loud, messy, and ultimately unsatisfying victory. My plan was more subtle, more insidious, and far more poetic. I wanted them to live inside the consequences of their actions, to be daily, hourly, minutely reminded of the power they had lost and the daughter they had betrayed. I became the ghost in their machine, the invisible force that now dictated the terms of their existence. A week after the settlement, a thick, formal residency agreement arrived via courier. It was a 20-page document, drafted by Evelyn, that laid out the New World Order. They were designated as legacy tenants, a title I had invented that sounded dignified but meant nothing. The agreement stipulated that they could live in the house, rent-free, for as long as the new owner, the anonymous Hale Family Trusts, saw fit. It also stipulated that they were not to make any alterations to the property, that all major household decisions would now be made by a designated property manager, and that the trust retained the right to access the property for archival and preservation purposes with 24 hours' notice. They were no longer masters of their own castle. They were caretakers in a museum dedicated to their own failure. My first act as the new owner was to reclaim my history. I hired a team of professional art handlers and archivists, and I sent them into the mansion. Their task was to conduct a complete inventory of the home's contents for insurance and archival purposes. I can only imagine my mother's horror as these quiet, white-gloved strangers moved through her perfectly curated rooms, placing small, numbered tags on her precious antiques, photographing her silver, and making notes on her porcelain. These objects, the props she had used to build her identity, were no longer hers. They were simply assets, items on a long, impersonal list that belonged to me. The most significant act of this quiet occupation was the transformation of the grand two-story foyer. For my entire life, it had been a shrine to Liam. A massive, oil-painted portrait of him from his college graduation hung above the sweeping staircase. The walls were lined with framed photos of his every minor achievement: a Little League trophy, a high school debate plaque, a picture of him shaking hands with a local congressman. I was nowhere to be seen. One Tuesday morning, while they were all out, my team went in. The portrait of Liam was carefully taken down, crated, and put into storage. The shrine was dismantled. In its place, I hung a single magnificent piece, a massive, beautifully framed, large-format photograph of my grandmother's lake house, taken at sunrise, the mist rising off the water, the old porch swing still and waiting. Beneath it, on a small, elegant brass plaque, were the words, "The Margaret Hale House, founded 1952, in memory of a true and lasting legacy." When my parents and brother came home that day, they were greeted not by the triumphant image of their golden boy, but by a silent, powerful monument to the memory they had tried to sell. It was a declaration of what was truly valuable, what had truly endured. They never mentioned it, but the portrait's absence was a gaping wound in the heart of the house. Liam's world, outside the mansion's walls, was imploding. The lawsuit from his investors proceeded, and without the infusion of my money, he had no resources to fight it. He was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. The flashy downtown office was shuttered. The leased cars were repossessed, and his reputation in the small, gossipy world of local finance was utterly destroyed. He ended up taking a job as a clerk at a shipping company, the only place that would hire him. He, who had always soared on the hot air of his own potential, was now grounded, forced to do the kind of steady, unglamorous work he had always disdained. He moved back into his childhood bedroom in the mansion, a 34-year-old bankrupt living as a tenant in his sister's house. The humiliation was his constant companion. My parents, trapped in their beautiful prison, began to change. The performance was over. There was no one left to impress. My father, stripped of his financial authority, started spending his days in the mansion's neglected greenhouse, quietly tending to the orchids. My mother, with no social events to plan, started reading. She would sit for hours in the vast, silent library, working her way through the classics. The silence in the house was no longer tense. It was heavy with a new, unfamiliar introspection. I took no pleasure in their quiet suffering. My actions had not been about punishment. They had been about balance. I was an archivist, and my family's history had been a chaotic, mislabeled mess. I was simply restoring order, recataloguing the events, and assigning every person and every memory its proper, true, and lasting value. As the seasons turned, so did the tide of my own life. While my family was living in the quiet aftermath of their implosion, I was in the midst of a joyful, creative explosion. The lake house, which I had legally and officially bought back from the terrified couple who had purchased it, became the center of my new universe. The act of reclaiming it was a profound one. I wasn't just buying back a property, I was buying back my own peace of mind. I poured my heart, my soul, and my resources into making it not just a home, but a legacy. I officially launched the Margaret Hale Trust, not as a vengeful tool to control my family, but as a legitimate, powerful foundation dedicated to what my grandmother and I had both loved: the preservation of local history. The mansion, now legally owned by the trust, became its endowment, a massive, income-generating asset. Through a partnership with Thorn Capital, we began to lease out the mansion's ballroom and grand parlors for high-end corporate events and historical society fundraisers, turning my parents' monument to vanity into a source of real, tangible good for the community. The Foundation's first major project was the creation of a digital archive for our town's historical society, a small, underfunded organization that had been struggling for years. We funded the purchase of state-of-the-art scanners and software, and I personally oversaw the project, training a team of student volunteers. It was the work I had been born to do, and I was doing it on my own terms, funded by my own success. My life was no longer a secret. The story of the Silas Croft discovery had been quietly reported in academic journals, and I had gained a small but significant reputation in my field as a historical detective. I was invited to speak at conferences, to consult on projects, and I was, for the first time, being seen and valued for the exact skills my family had dismissed as a useless hobby. I maintained a necessary professional distance from my family, but I was not entirely without compassion. I knew they were struggling to adjust to their new, diminished reality. Through the Foundation, I arranged for them to receive a modest monthly stipend, framed as a caretaker's fee for their continued residency at the mansion. It was enough for their daily needs, but not enough to fund the lavish lifestyle they had lost. It was a quiet acknowledgement that they were still my family, but it was also a firm reinforcement of the new power dynamic. I was no longer their secret slush fund. I was their formal benefactor, and the terms were mine to set. The most profound change, however, came from an unexpected discovery. While going through the last of my grandmother's boxes, I found a small, locked recipe box. The key was taped to the bottom. Inside, there were no recipes. There were letters, dozens of them. They were letters my grandmother had written to me, but had never sent. One for each of my birthdays, from the day I was born until the year she died. They were a secret, running commentary on my life, her private archive of my existence. I sat on the floor of my lake house and read them all, tears streaming down my face. She had seen everything. She wrote about her frustration with my parents' blindness, her anger at their blatant favoritism of Liam. They are polishing a brass statue while they ignore the solid gold one sitting in the corner, she wrote on my 16th birthday. She wrote about her pride in my quiet accomplishments, the academic awards they ignored, the kindness they took for granted. And then, in the final letter, written just a few months before she passed away, she wrote the words that would become the cornerstone of my new life. "My dearest Chloe," it began, "I am leaving you the house, the only real thing we have left. I know your mother and father will not understand. They will see it as a burden, as an asset to be leveraged for your brother. They will, I fear, one day try to take it from you. Do not let them. This house is not just wood and stone. It is proof that you exist. It is proof that you are valued. Your life is not a footnote in your brother's story. It is the main text. Do not ever let anyone, especially not the people who are supposed to love you most, convince you otherwise. You are the custodian of your own story. Tell it well." I held the letter to my chest, the old, familiar paper soft as a whisper against my skin. She had known. She had armed me. The house wasn't just a lifeboat, it was a map and a mission, and I was finally ready to follow it. Last weekend, the Margaret Hale Trust hosted its inaugural gala. It was held, of course, at the Hawthorne Estates mansion. The night was a glittering, unqualified success, a convergence of all the disparate threads of my new life. The rooms were filled with academics, philanthropists, historians, and the quiet, powerful money of Thorne Capital. It was a celebration of history, of legacy, and of the future we were building. Marcus Thorne gave a speech in which he called me one of the shrewdest and most visionary partners he had ever worked with. Professor Davies, my old mentor, was there, his face beaming with a pride that felt more paternal than anything my own father had ever shown me. My parents and Liam were in attendance, but their roles were new ones. They were not the hosts. They were volunteers. My father, his hands now calloused from his work in the garden, helped direct parking. My mother, her social grace now channeled into something useful, managed the check-in table. And Liam, in a simple black uniform, worked as a bartender, quietly and efficiently serving drinks to the powerful, successful people he had once so desperately and so unsuccessfully tried to be. Late in the evening, as the party swirled around me, my father found me standing alone on the grand terrace, looking out over the moonlit lawn. He was quiet for a long moment, just standing beside me. "This is what the house was always meant to be, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and raspy. "Not just a showpiece. A place with a real purpose." I didn't look at him. I just kept my eyes on the horizon. "Its purpose was always to be a home, Dad," I replied. "You guys were the ones who turned it into a showpiece." He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it without argument. "I've been reading some of the history you've compiled about the place," he said. "The original family who built it. The architect. It's fascinating. I never knew any of it." It was the closest he had ever come to showing interest in my work, in my world. It wasn't an apology, not really. But it was an acknowledgement. It was a sign that the ghost he had never seen was finally, slowly, coming into focus. I am not the custodian of my family's secrets anymore. I am the architect of my own legacy. The journey of this past year has taught me the most important archival lesson of all, that you must be the one to curate your own life. You must decide which stories to preserve and which ones to pack away in a box in the basement. You must decide which artifacts are priceless and which are just gilded junk. My family's love was a beautiful, hollow object that shattered under the slightest pressure. My grandmother's love was a small, sturdy, wooden house that could withstand any storm. I chose which one to save. The mansion, the money, the power, they are just tools. My real victory is not in what I own, but in who I have become. I am a woman who knows her own history, and therefore controls her own future. The greatest irony is that by taking their home, I have given my family the one thing they never had: a chance to build an authentic life, stripped of all the artifice and illusion. They are finally learning to live without a stage, without an audience. They are learning to be real, and I, from the quiet porch of my grandmother's house, am finally, peacefully, gloriously free. What about you? What is the lake house in your own life, the one thing that is so precious, so tied to your identity, that you would fight to the ends of the earth to protect it? Share your story in the comments below. I truly believe that sharing our histories is the most powerful way to reclaim them. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the quiet strength of the sensible ones, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more true stories about finding your own power in the most unexpected places. And please, share this video with anyone who might need to be reminded that sometimes the most valuable inheritance is the strength you didn't know you had. Thank you for listening. May you always be the faithful custodian of your own magnificent story.